Hello everyone, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I don't claim that my builds are the best in the game, and I'm sure there are better ways to optimize some of them, but be aware that I do tend to get my builds at least endgame viable. This includes things like arbitration, steel path, eidolon hunts, etc. Now that this is out of the way, these timestamps have been left here and in the description for your convenience. Feel free to skip around, but I'll start with the basics first just in case people don't know how to play this frame. So starting with the stats. Armor is 250 for prime and 190 for non-prime. This puts you at 45.5% damage reduction and 38.8% damage reduction respectively. The prime definitely got a big jump in armor, which also helps one of his abilities quite a bit. For energy, we have 150 for both. This puts you at 225 at max. For health, you're looking at 125 for both. This puts you at 375 at max. For shield, you're looking at 50 for both. This puts you at 150 at max. Having a below average shield like this actually helps you get shield gate back easier and works incredibly well with things like brief respite and decaying dragon key. For sprint speed, you're looking at 1.2 for prime and 1.15 for non-prime. Obviously the prime is a bit faster, and for this frame, the sprint matters more than most other frames simply because of his passive and first ability, making him one of the faster runners in the game, able to easily keep up with people actually doing other maneuvers. In terms of acquisition, regular Nezha is obtained in the Dojo Tenno Lab, while Prime is currently unvaulted, so definitely pick one up while you still can. Moving on to his abilities, starting with the passive, slide 60% faster and go 35% farther. So because he slides faster and goes further, slide can be tapped to get a quick burst of movement, which can then even be changed with a roll to go super far. He definitely has one of the better passives in the game, but if you're weird and don't like this, you can turn it off with one of his augments. Moving on to his second ability, Firewalker. Blaze a trail of flame, scorching enemies and cleansing allies. Teleporting blasts a landing area with a ring of fire. So you click the ability and he puts fire under his feet for the duration of the ability. The fire obviously does fire damage to enemies, which reduces enemy armor by 50% on affected targets. The fire also provides status immunity and cleansing effects for you and allies that are within the fire. This ability works with his second ability, which I'll go into when I go over that ability. While active, he is 25% faster, and in terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, duration of the ability being active, as well as the fire trail duration is affected by ability duration. Explosion radius, when used with his second ability, is affected by ability range. The damage per second of the fire and the explosion damage when used with the second ability is affected by ability strength. This is also Nezha's subsumed ability when given to the Helminth. Moving on to his second ability, Blazing Chakram. Hurl a flaming ring that sets enemies ablaze, making them vulnerable to any damage. Flaming enemies drop restorative orbs on death. Charge to amplify the power of the ring and reactivate to instantly travel to the ring's location. So you either tap to throw the ring, which bounces around hitting multiple enemies, or you hold to cast, which makes the ring go faster and through enemies rather than bouncing. You can tap the ability again while the ring is flying, as seen on the map, to teleport to it. Enemies that are hit by the ring are set on fire for 6 seconds. Additionally, affected enemies are given a debuff that makes them more vulnerable to damage for the set duration as seen on the abilities page. Enemies under the effects of the damage vulnerability have a 100% chance to drop a health orb and a 35% chance to drop an energy orb. This ability has synergy with his first and fourth ability. If his first ability is activated when he teleports to the ring, a ring of fire around the area will be made. If he casts this ability on an enemy affected by his fourth ability, it will make multiple rings that seek other targets as well, allowing you to affect more enemies per cast of Chakram. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, duration of the target is affected by the damage vulnerability is affected by ability duration, while the fire proc is not. Damage vulnerability, damage, and boosted damage is affected by ability strength, and range does not affect throw distance. Moving on to his third ability, Warding Halo. Create a protective ring of fire that also stuns and damages enemies who get too close. So you cast the ability, and you get a brief period of invulnerability, which takes all stored damage and multiplies it as seen on the abilities page. This multiplied damage turns into a ward that stops 90% of the damage from hitting Nezha, while the rest of the 10% hits Nezha. To sum it up, just press 3 for 90% damage reduction and recast when it goes down. While active, enemies that get too close are dealt slash damage, which also stuns enemies. When the ward falls, nearby enemies are dealt fire damage, causing a stun, and gives a brief invulnerability, giving you enough time to recast. While this is active, Nezha gains status immunity, preventing things like being on fire, drain from magnetic effects, and even knockdowns. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, damage absorption is affected by ability strength and armor modifiers, while damage per second of the slash and absorption multiplier is affected by only strength. The radius of the slash is affected by ability range. Moving on to his last ability, Divine Spears. Impale nearby enemies on spears that are up from the below. Activate again to slam surviving enemies back into the ground. So you press it, and enemies get stuck on some spears, dealing puncture damage. It holds them there until the duration runs out, or you activate it again, slamming any affected enemies back down for impact damage. As mentioned previously, this ability synergizes with his second ability. When casting 2 on enemies affected by Divine Spears, it summons new rings that go out and seek other targets. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, Radius is affected by ability range, duration of enemies being stunned is affected by ability duration, and damage is affected by ability strength. Moving on to his ability Augments, starting with Controlled Slide. Disable Nezha's passive ability, increase ability strength by 15%. This just turns off his passive and gives you extra strength for it. So it basically acts as an alternative for Power Drift in terms of where it goes and the fact that it gives the same amount of strength. Moving on to his next augment, Pyroclastic Flow. Firewalker augment. Accumulate 150% of the damage Firewalker deals, unleashing it in a trail of fire that lasts 10 seconds. So basically you accumulate bonus damage as enemies get damage from Firewalker trails. Once you're satisfied with how much damage you've accumulated, you can kick it all out into one long trail by recasting it. If you don't recast it before it ends, it will still hold that damage until you do release it. The damage on this is pretty high with no mods and barely any stacked damage, so it's hard to call it a bad augment. However, it seems pretty niche to use up an entire mod slot for it. Moving on to his third augment, Reaping Chakram, Blazing Chakram augment. Each enemy hit increases the ring's damage by 2 times and the chance for enemies to drop health orbs on death by plus 0.25 times. So it essentially doubles in damage every time it hits a target. This can make it ramp up in damage a ton. But since the Chakram is more utility for Nezha, I don't see this as particularly useful for the damage. The part that is interesting is for the extra health orbs. However, this isn't actually working for me for some reason, but I've seen clips of people using this and health orbs just rain out of enemies after using this. I have no idea why it doesn't work for me, but because of this reason, I won't be using it in my builds. I wasted an entire day trying to get this to work, and it just simply didn't. Out of every 20 enemies I killed, on average 2 or 3 gave an extra health orb, which is just not worth the mod slot for me. This ability already guarantees 1 health orb and sometimes even extra energy, which is good enough for me. Moving on to his last augment, Safeguard. Warding Halo augment can now be cast on allies with 50% effectiveness. So this is pretty self-explanatory. You can now cast this ability on an ally, which gives them status immunity and 90% damage reduction. You can track the ward health of teammates by the bar that shows near their sidebar on your screen. It's half as effective on teammates, but is still decent if you need someone to stay alive a bit longer. At this point in the video, I like to answer the question, is this frame Steel Path viable? Can it run arbitrations? Is it part of the Eidolon hunts? I wouldn't personally use him on an Eidolon hunt, but Nezha is incredibly good. Having a whole bunch of tank and even a means to get health through his kit makes him an ideal tank. He even has a crowd control ability with his 4th, while also being able to lower the defense of targets. His passive also makes him super speedy when used to gain momentum quickly, and when paired with his first ability, makes him one of the fastest sprinters in the game, and he doesn't even have to try. A quick disclaimer before we get into things. I use an Umbra Forma on my Nezha because I have 2 builds using different polarities, and I want to be able to push the extra stats from the Umbra mods. You may see that I only included 1 build, and that's because my second one only switches out 1 mod, which incites the need for the Umbra Forma. Unfortunately, there is no way around this, except to just not use the Umbral mods, but this brings his effectiveness down by quite a bit. I'll be giving the non-Umbral versions that are compatible to have one added later, just so that you can get him going till you can get your hands on an Umbra Forma. As a quick mention, I won't be using Umbral Fiber on these builds because there are better ways to get even more armor without wasting a mod slot on minimal gain. So moving into the build, we have my tank build. This build is designed to have absolutely no issues in things like Steel Path or even Lich and Sister Hunting if you really needed to. In terms of helmet, you're going to want whatever really. Whatever you decide to add, one is probably your best bet to replace as we'll be using the rest of our kit. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 3 Forma. I use 1 Umbra Forma for the reason I mentioned in the disclaimer. If you don't have one, here's the build you'll do instead. It takes 2 Forma, and you can add the Umbra Forma later to make it work. Just keep in mind it's weaker without the Umbra Forma. Additionally, you'll add 1 Nariman and 1 Materai. Going over the mods, starting with the Aura. So obviously, I like to use Enemy Radar. This has always been one of my favorite mods. You can use other things here if you really wanted to. Of course, you'd have to format that if you were to do that. Moving on to the next mod, Equilibrium. Equilibrium gives us energy back whenever we pick up a health orb. If you don't like this type of style where we spam the chakram for extra energy, then replace this with Streamline. Going into the next mod, we have Health Conversion. Why do we use Health Conversion? Well, we use it because it is a crap ton of armor. It's 1300 armor, and obviously we're getting this consistently because his second ability gives us health orbs. We're using this over something like Umbrella Fiber because, of course, this only gives us 500 armor, whereas this gives us 1300. Next, we have Umbrella Intensify and Vitality to boost each other. This just gives us the much needed strength and health that we'll be needing. And then we have Prime Flow to pair with Equilibrium because we're going to be having a lot of energy. As long as we're hitting our 2 quite often, we won't have any issues with energy. Next, we have Adaptation because just having an extra 90% damage reduction on top of the 90% that we're getting from Warding Halo is incredibly strong. It's good to have. Next, we have Transient Fortitude to boost our strength even more, but of course this brings down our duration a bit. Not a huge issue. If you really wanted to, like say you had Energize or something, you could use Blind Rage here. And then lastly, this is kind of a flex spot, but I chose to do Prime Continuity just so my debuff on my Blazing Chakram lasts longer and the stun from Divine Spears lasts longer. That's pretty much all there is to it. In terms of arcanes, you have options. It really comes down to preference. Some of my favorites is Guardian, Energize, and Grace. And if you wanted to go for a melee style, Fury and Strike can also be pretty good. This really just comes down to preference, but if you have a max Energize, maybe consider using Blind Rage over Transient Fortitude. In terms of misc requirements, just run something that can kill, as Nezha himself doesn't do a lot of the killing. Additionally, you'll want to run Synth Fiber on your companion if you are using Equilibrium, as this will allow you to pick up health orbs even when at full health. This will allow you to get a ton of energy. In terms of Operator School, run whatever suits you best. I prefer Nariman or Zenuric depending on what I'm doing, but this build is meant to work without an Operator School. Normally this is where I show how to use it quickly, and I will do that in a minute, but I just want to mention that I have a second build which literally just swaps one mod. It swaps out Health Conversion with the Safeguard Augment. Of course, if I didn't have an Umbra Forma, I wouldn't be able to do this, which is why I did it in the first place. Optionally, with this build, you could add a Zenuric Forma to the Exilus to add Power Drift or a Controlled Slide for the added strength. I just do this for situations where I may need to keep something alive more. So a quick how to use. You go headfirst into some enemies, and then from here you can press 4 and then press 2. Kill the enemies that were affected, and you'll get a whole bunch of energy back. From this point, you'll probably start getting shot at, so it'd be a good time to get your 3 active, and then press your 1 eventually, and that'll give you some extra speed. The reason why we do the Divine Spears and Chakram first is so we can get our health conversion up, so we can start getting a really beefy Warding Halo right as soon as we start. So here I go into some gameplay where I debuff the Acolyte, and of course I just sit in front of him not really caring because I have so much damage reduction, and he doesn't even get a hit out of me anyway. As you can see, I'm just kind of sitting in front of a bunch of enemies, and literally they just do nothing. I can just face tank everything all day, every day. The next clip I have here, I just show how much energy you actually get from this build. As you can see, that was 225 health, which would have translated to probably like closer to 250 energy. Not to mention it actually spawns energy orbs on top of it. So it's, yeah, this is really good. Crowd control, tank, debuff, it's got everything you need in it. And that's pretty much Nezha. So that is the complete Nezha guide. He's pretty good, and I can definitely recommend him for just about anything. If you enjoyed the video or helped in any way, please leave a like. And if you're looking forward to future content like this, subscribe and stay tuned. If I miss anything or you'd like to leave some feedback, leave it down in the comments. I appreciate all the support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.